Welcome all to this event run by the Indigenous Studies Discussion Group, or the ISDG, at the University of Cambridge. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are grateful to the Center for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities and the Cambridge Heritage Research Center for their support of this group and for making this event possible. The ISDG is a graduate student-led initiative started in 2019 with the objectives of promoting scholarship by and about Indigenous peoples across disciplines and spaces to be a regular feature of the intellectual life of Cambridge, and also to promote the sharing and discussion of insights and ideas pertaining to Indigenous studies across peoples, disciplines, times, and geographies. Tonight's panel discussion is on the topic of erasures and constructions of indigeneity, challenging perceptions of continuity and authenticity, with the aims of centering Indigenous existence, resistance, and survivance to counter persisting colonial essentialist ideas of identity, which often become narratives of extinction. This event falls into this term's ISDG topic, which is tackling the myths of Indigenous extinctions, these pervasive fallacies used to justify past and continuing colonialism, genocide, and erasure. Further events this term will include a film screening and a later discussion between museum professionals from Cambridge and Oxford, both on this topic. But please visit our links in the chat that will be posted soon to find out more about our program. My name is Oliver Antczak. I'm a third-year PhD student in Heritage Studies from Venezuela and Poland, and I'm collaborating with 3 Indigenous communities on the islands of Bonaire, Margarita in Venezuela, and Trinidad and Tobago to better understand the impacts of different colonialisms on present-day Indigenous identity and heritage, and to improve heritage management practices in places where the myths of Indigenous extinction are prevalent. I'll be the moderator for tonight's event. Tonight, we are joined by a distinguished panel of experts from a diversity of disciplines and geographies. We will be hearing from, in order, Keolu Fox, Antonio Castanha, Theresa Sainty, and Zoe Rimmer. Each of our speakers will give us a 15 to 20-minute presentation discussing the topics and the themes of the event. And after these presentations, we will follow with a Q&A session. But before that, and before introducing and handing over to Keolu, our first speaker, there's just a few housekeeping points for those of you who are joining us virtually, which is everyone this time. Unfortunately, we can't do these in person yet. So first of all, please keep your microphones turned off unless we call on you in the question and answer session. Secondly, the event will be recorded, so please keep that in mind and keep your cameras on or off as you prefer. By remaining in the room as we record the meeting, you consent to be recorded, and the recording will be available on the CRASH website and on the ISDG Cambridge YouTube channel soon after the event. You can also find those links in the chat. During the Q&A session, if you would like to ask a question, please use the chat function to send a message to the general chat or to me, and we will read it aloud. If you want to ask your question in person, please indicate that in your chat or use the raise hand function. Captioning has been enabled for this event. If you would like to have captioning, you can select it at the bottom of your screen. Please note the captions are provided by Zoom, and we cannot be held responsible for the accuracy of those. They're automatically generated. Rest assured, you will be able to revisit the event recording on YouTube as well, to hear things twice. We are doing our best to provide an inclusive environment in this online event, and it goes without saying that we expect all attendees to show respect and courtesy to the speakers and each other throughout the event. Now, to introduce our first speaker. Keolu Fox is the first native Hawaiian to receive a doctorate in genome sciences and is an assistant professor at the University of California, San Diego, where he is a co-founder and co-director of the world's first Indigenous Futures Institute. Keolu is also affiliated with the Halisioglu Data Science Institute, so sorry for pronunciation, the Department of Anthropology, the Global Health Program, the Climate Action Lab, and the Design Lab. Keolu's work focuses on the connection between raw data as a resource and the emerging value of genomic health data from Indigenous communities. He has experience designing and engineering genome sequencing and editing technologies, and a decade of grassroots experience working with Indigenous partners to advance precision medicine. Keolu's work has been in the international media spotlight with recognition in outlets such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many others that you will be familiar with. He was named a TED Fellow in 2016, a National Geographic Emerging Explorer in 2017, and an Emerson Collective Fellow in 2020. Currently, Keolu serves as a board member and advisor for the Native Biodata Consortium, Variant Bio, the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation's Human Cell Atlas program, 23andMe, and others. And this year, Keolu is a new member of the World Economic Forum's Global Futures Council on Synthetic Biology and has served as a guest curator at the Bishop Museum, co-designing a critically acclaimed exhibit entitled Regenerations, Challenging Scientific Racism in Hawaii. In 2022, Keolu has also been selected by Robert Downey Jr. and the Footprint Coalition to manage a venture capital portfolio focused on providing fast grants focused on Indigenous futurism and climate resilience. And with that, I'd like to welcome Keolu and hand it over to you.
Thank you all so much. That was so kind. This is very exciting. I'll try to be quick because I know we have a lot to cover today. And I'm joining you from Oahu today, but I usually work in California in the La Jolla area in Kumeyaay Nation. And this is just kind of like a standard drone shot of our campus. And it's a lovely place to work. And I've titled this talk, Missing Sequences, Why Just Increasing Diversity in Genome Sciences Isn't Enough. And I'll kind of get to where I want to, hopefully, about erasure and about how it's very important that people from communities co-design large-scale projects with those communities and scientists in all the ways that bias manifests in the interpretation of data and how that leads to the erasure of a lot of really important things. But thanks again. I'll try to keep it snappy. So University of California, San Diego is perennially ranked by Surfer Magazine, the #1 university in the United States of America. So I only applied to one place as a professor. And luckily I got a job there. It's an amazing place to work. It's also a special place and sort of a unique ecosystem for people that are in genome engineering, genome editing, genome sequencing, and biotechnology development. So it's got this kind of unique confluence. It's also a special place in terms of diaspora for Pacific Islander people. A lot of our communities end up in Southern California and specifically the San Diego area. It's also on the border of Mexico and America, which is very interesting in terms of the types of scholarship that comes out of our university. And I recommend that you come and check it out. And we just started the Indigenous Futures Institute, and we would love to have many of you there as speakers and collaborators, or if you're interested in scholarship and residence programs and things like this. So I wanted to just extend that aloha to you. Beyond the beautiful surfing and diving and amazing Mexican food. Okay. But I'm originally from here. I'm originally from the Big Island of Hawaii. This is Pololu Valley. This is where my ancestors are from. And Pololu is on the northernmost tip of the Big Island of Hawaii. And it's a special place. The Big Island of Hawaii is all at once a biological diversity hotspot. It's also with, I don't know, I think 11 out of 13 biomes on planet Earth or something like this. It has extremely diverse soil profiles, and it's also the extinction capital of the world and the invasive species capital of the world. It's a really unique place to think about erasure, to think about biological diversity in that sense, and the effects of colonialism, globalization in many different industries. And it's impossible to come from a place like that and not have that on your mind at all times, shaping the science that you create or the scholarship that you create. My family is from an area called Kohala originally, which is all mixed up. I mean, we have the second largest ranch in the United States of America. I know when people think about ranching in Europe, they probably think of like Texas and Budweiser cans and Chevrolet trucks, but we do things differently. In fact, there's a picture on the right of Ikua Purdy, who is one of our first representatives from our community to go over and just break every single record that existed in the rodeos in the mainland in Wyoming. And they wrote in the newspaper a funny quote upon him winning. They said, "We didn't know what to make of them, whether they were cowboys or Indians." And so I thought that was really funny because that really represents our community. We've been mixing our genomes with people from all over the world for so long in Hawaii. We've had communities come from Madeira and Japan and Lisbon and Spain and England and Scotland and, name a country in Europe. Also huge diasporas of people coming from the Caribbean to work in the sugarcane industry. So when you come to a place like the Big Island, it's quite diverse. And so is the rest of our archipelago. Here's a photo that I saw at a recent holiday, and I saw it on the wall and I was like, "Who's that?" And they're like, "Oh, that's Tutu Buzzy. That's one of my, my great grandmas." And she rode horses. And I know you guys are in England, many of you. I wanted to show you a picture. We ride horses. We don't do side saddle. For hundreds of years, we've been riding these horses right. And that's Tutu Buzzy there. And there's this beautiful photo I just put from Herb Kane of these Ka'u riders, which is from a specific area, again, in the region where we live. And it's a unique culture. We have a unique heritage, but also Hawaii County, the county I'm from, is the most diverse county in the United States of America, according to our recent census data for 2020. Not only that, Hawaii has 4 out of the top 10 counties in America in terms of diversity. And a lot of that has to do with all of the different communities of people that have worked and lived in Hawaii and began to mix. And so you see Hawaii County is number 1, followed by Maui County, followed by Kauai County, followed by Honolulu. And it's impossible not to think about the different ways in which, population genetics contributes to like our understanding of history, our understanding of disease predilection, and all of our new trajectories for personalized medicine become very complicated because our genomes are very complicated. And it's a lovely place to live. But ever since I was a little kid, I've always wondered about how we got there. You would hear legends and stories from our kupuna and elders. This would usually be complemented by archaeological research, anthropological research, and linguistic research from different types of scholars, but none of those scholars were actually from our communities. So there was a bit of not necessarily a rivalry if something wasn't consistent with the time estimates and things that we had, but a bit of a chip on our shoulder, like, who are you to tell us where we came from, kind of thing. And that persists today. And I put this picture up here because it's really interesting. It shows our diaspora out of Taiwan into the Bismarck Archipelago, and then into what master navigator and wayfinder Nainoa Thompson always refers to as the original moonshot. So this would be the largest and most expedited human migration in history, over 1,000 years, traveling the space of Europe plus Asia, back and forth dynamically between all these island nations and some of the most remote places in the world. And the pathways and the timing of that is always represented as like a single arrow, as you can see here, with a time estimate, which is not actually an accurate, it's sort of a disservice to how dynamic all of these oceanic superhighways were. And I always thought that was funny because when I talked to my kumu or teachers for sailing, they'd be like, "Yeah, that's not true. We go back and forth all the time. We're using all this complex metadata, bird migration patterns, swells, the green glint on the bottom of a cloud reflecting from a lagoon to let you know there's land 300, miles away." And all of that gets erased when you create a single unidirectional arrow indicating the direction. It also disconnects our communities. That is to say, the Maori language and the Tahitian language are very similar to our language. So when you tell us that we're separate, it's problematic. When you divide the ocean into Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia, that's problematic. That's not the label we give ourselves. And because of that, it allows for separation when we're actually looking for unity. So the ways that we should interpret data moving forward, I think, should be more complex, and they should speak to how dynamic somewhere like the Pacific is, the world's oldest ocean, right? And I grew up a lot of the time hearing about Kon-Tiki and Thor Heyerdahl and all of his incorrect and racist rhetoric, but the world loved it. They loved learning about Kon-Tiki. They loved learning about Thor Heyerdahl and his adventures. And that is to say, like, without him, there probably wouldn't be this birth in experimental archaeology, right? Or at least attention to detail around voyaging in the Pacific amongst scholarly communities, even if people in Hawaii and Tahiti already knew how we got there. But the narrative was that we drifted over helplessly on rafts from South America, not that we had this impressive command of technology and the scientific method and metadata, and that we iterated on all of these different technologies and came up with things like the catamaran and this just deep, deep, deep knowledge that was not actually erased, but it was discredited over time. And that's why when he crashed, we were laughing really hard, really, really hard. And we were even more excited about Hokulea. Hokulea for us is birthed out of the time of experimental archaeology. So there was like this wash of erasure, and then there was our reaction to that as a community. And by designing this boat and the science and engineering that went into that and the rehabilitation of our culture, it just revitalized the whole Pacific Ocean. Obviously, as Hawaiians, we like to think we're, you know, the main character in the play, but that's not true. There are so many different cultures and communities that were involved in this. There were people that were of European ancestry, like Ben Finney, that were instrumental in enabling this to happen. And it happened together, and it empowered our people. And this is what it looked like when Hokulea rolled up to Papaete in 1976. That looks like a party to me. You can't even see the champagne bottles because they probably drank it all already. But this was the birth of our renaissance within our culture and the way that we connect many different lines of sight and evidence to refine our understanding of our diaspora in the Pacific. This was the beginning. And so for me, it was awesome to get to work and use my skill set with my community and say, all right, I know that we could probably use contemporary modern genomes of people from the Pacific, and we can retrace our paths and timings of the sort of networks of our diaspora using modern genomic technology. And while we were forced to use unidirectional black arrows, at least we got to refine the timing. And at least if you'll look at the names of the islands, they're all in our native tongue. It's not Easter Island, it's Rapa Nui, right? It's Mangareva. So it's really cool. And this project was like 10 years in the making, but it's really cool to see our language used in nature and to see the dynamic nature of our voyaging history on full display. And it gets to be complemented and recombined with all of these other lines of evidence. It's pretty cool. What's not cool though, again, is even if you try to take a step forward, sometimes the media makes you take a step back. And again, one of the headlines, so think about this, if you're Science magazine, no offense, love these guys, but if you're Science magazine, would you choose this picture and this headline to represent our work? No one could have predicted this. DNA offers how Polynesia was set. Well, actually, like everybody predicted this. And it was kind of disappointing. There were other kind of takes on it. This one is a little more hyperbolic. 5,000 years ago, a group of people left Taiwan and changed the world. Well, I guess that's sort of reductionist. It doesn't speak to the complexity, but it's another way of attempting to be futuristic. And then if you don't like something done, you know, if you're upset about it, do it yourself. So I wrote this article for Scientific American, and I got to say, genomes show the history and travels of indigenous peoples. Yeah, that's true. It's a little broad, but you know, at least I got to have a photo credit of our local Va'a sailing boat here in Hilo. And I got to use this our lovely language again. Ikavama mua kavama hope, the future is in the past. We're walking backwards into the future. Very famous saying throughout the Pacific. And there, I focus on not only our diaspora, but what it means and what's the impact of this historically. How does this impact our health? What types of things can we detect, right? Founder events, bottlenecks. When you say bottleneck, what do you mean? We mean a reduction in genetic diversity. We mean that we can detect erasure. We mean that we can detect a naive soil epidemic where 80% of the population collapses because of exposure to smallpox or some other germ. That's the type of eraser and power we have when we use genetic information, and it's in the hands of the people that are from those communities. That's the level of impact. And how is this shaping our contemporary genomes? How does that shape our susceptibility to COVID-19 and many other things? And people like to narrativize many other mutations. ABO, for example, has a story behind it. High elevation, EPAS1, right? So you have these different narratives that are painted by storytellers using data that's very correlative. And this is what Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin referred to as just so stories. And we can take it a step further and say, well, what does it look like when indigenous people challenge the narratives that are built around their mutations, that are discovered in them by other people? Well, we can reverse engineer them, right? We can reverse engineer them using genome editing tools, and we can actually test and see what they do. So you can't BS us now. These tools are ubiquitous. And so in that sense, we're combating erasure by rewriting history using these types of tools. And that's exactly what we've done here with this CREBRF mutation. We've reverse engineered it into isogenic cell lines. So if you say it's a thrifty gene, prove it. Show us what happens when you starve these cells from insulin. Show us that it predisposes to obesity and protects against type 2 diabetes. But you got to show the receipts, and we'd like to see that in data. So all of that is to say, we've always been indigenous futurists here in Hawaii. We created some of the first color newspapers in the world. We've had electricity in Iolani Palace well before the White House here in America. And we will continue to use the best tools available to empower our people. And that's why we've started this venture capital fund with the Footprint Coalition, Variant Bio, Native Biodata Consortia, Ginkgo Bioworks, and Indigenous Futures Institute. And we're giving away seed grants, fast grants, to anybody who wants to focus on projects that are in the interface of Indigenous futurism and climate resilience. And please check out our website, and I'm happy to coordinate or help you guys with your applications if anyone's interested. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keolu, for sharing your work and your story, and in such a personal way. I think it was really, really nice to be carried along that journey with you. Our next speaker would have been Antonio Castanha, but unfortunately, it looks like he's having trouble joining us. So if that's okay with you, Theresa, can we call you up first? Will that be okay? All right, let me introduce Theresa then. Theresa Sainty is a Pakana woman from the northeast coast of Lutruwita, Tasmania, from a large, well-known family from Flinders and Cape Barren Islands and mainland Lutruwita. Currently working on her PhD as a senior Indigenous scholarship holder at the University of Tasmania, Theresa's research, Languages Power, Language Retrieval, Reconstruction, and Revival, the Next Steps Towards Fluency, taking Palawa Kani from Aboriginal community knowledge to Aboriginal community fluency, focuses on strategies that language communities are employing in order to regain or maintain fluency. Theresa is an Aboriginal linguistic consultant for the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre, TAC, and has been working with the Palawakani language program since 1997, where she provides linguistic research and analysis. She also is a writer of songs, poetry, and articles, papers, speeches, and provides cultural advice and content for interpretation across a diverse range of projects. Theresa has extensive experience across Aboriginal affairs, having worked with the Tasmanian Department of Education, Aboriginal Education Services, where she co-developed and delivered Aboriginal cultural awareness training and produced curriculum resources for educators to assist in addressing the Australian curriculum cross-curriculum priority, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures. Theresa will briefly talk about the revitalization of Tasmanian Aboriginal language and the next steps for the Pakana community. And with that, we'd like to welcome you, Theresa. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Nari Nina too. So I think I could see a lot of parallels with Keolu's, some of what you talked about, Keolu, in terms of, we get really angry down here with people other than our community, telling our story. And we're still dealing with that with non-Aboriginal historians, being the experts on us. I've called this presentation Reclaiming Our Language. Palawakani is the name of our language, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But I'll just say Pulingina, welcome. Pulingina nina mapli, mina Theresa Sainty, mina kani nina tulu truida, pakana taimi ningina, mina kani nina tu palawakani, kani pakana. So I welcomed you all, told you my name, which you already know. I'm talking to you, I'm coming to you from Lutruwita, unceded Aboriginal land. And I'm talking to you in Palawakani, which is the language of Tasmanian Aborigines. Pakana mana makaralumi paiwuta, moini rumitina pumli palawa, waipapama. Rukiri kuntana pumli runi mana mapli Lutruwita, pumli minanya, pumli truwala, manina mapli. So our people, my people, Pakana Mana Mapli, have been here since the beginning of time. And archaeology is catching up to us, is only just catching up to us. Moyini and Rumitina Pumli Palawa. So Moyini and Rumitina were two stars in the sky and our creator beings who made Palawa, the first black man. After that, they cut the ground to make the islands, Runi, including Lutruwita. they made the mountains and created the river systems and water systems, and then all things within country. And that's just a very brief section of our creation story. Mina Tunapri Indigenous people from the 4 directions, all of you fellas around this earth of ours. Milatina Nanya, Ningimpi Nungampi Nanya. So I acknowledge in all Indigenous people, your country and your ancestors, and so Ningimpi Nungampi are your grandmothers and grandfathers. So we acknowledge that. I do come from a long line of strong women, Pakana women, as a result of our history here in Lotuira. This is my great-grandmother, who I'm named after. Whoops. My grandmother here, my mum, and me. And of course, Zoe, who comes after me, is my sister's daughter. So she's my daughter as well. I just haven't got a picture of her there. And so these women, these Pakana women, I call them Luna Rala, so strong women, are the ancestral women more recently of our community today. One of my ancestral women, Pularupana, was abducted by sealers and taken to the islands in Bass Strait, pardon me, in the early 1800s. And unfortunately, that is the fate, or was the fate, of many of our women. And it came down to about 9 of those women who are the ancestral women of our community today. And I acknowledge and thank them for their tenacity, their strength and determination in making sure that our community survived and thrived. We are a fiercely proud community, and one that was extinct even when I was at school in the 1970s. But strangely enough, at the same time, I think I just want to use Keolu's words. The birth of our Renaissance was around about the early 1970s when I was just a girl. So this is just my bit of my family here, my daughter, my husband, granddaughters. And so I thought I'd just do a brief walk through our history. It was a little bit difficult to know what to include, being such a diverse group of people talking with this morning. And I thought that possibly most people don't know much about our history here in Lotuira. Which is one of, it's the same story everywhere, I guess, about dispossession and about survival. So just a brief history. So this here is just a kind of a representation only of the original nations of Lotuira before invasion. And as I said earlier, we've been here since the beginning of time, since creation. And so we talk in terms of about 9 language groups. Each of those language groups supported smaller groups, or were made up of smaller groups of people. Some languages were related, and some, like the Western one up around here, were completely different to the Eastern and the Central and the Northern languages. So, of course, Invasion Day, every year we mark what they call Australia Day with a rally. for Invasion Day. And that began here in 1803, where the British occupied what is now called Risdon Cove, or Piura Kitina, as we call it. And then, of course, country was carved up, and the hunting grounds and ceremonial places were no longer accessible to our people. Aboriginal nations began to disappear almost immediately. Actually, before invasion, there were a few explorers, if you like, that called in, circumnavigated the island, and had some meetings with our people, and of course that caused introduced diseases way back from around about 1793. The first massacre was on the 3rd of May in 1804, and the Mumarimina people, that's at Risdon Cove, which is down the south of the state, were hunting, hunting wallaby and kangaroo, coming together as a large group of people, doing what they always have done, and Lieutenant Bowen's soldiers attacked them, and they killed many people. The settlements doctor actually collected the bodies of those people, of the dead, and packed them in lime to remove the flesh, and in barrels, and they were sent off for scientific interest. And so that was, that was the first example of grave robbing, but those old fellas were not in their graves yet. So I think I'll have to take that out. The settlements doctor also, they found a little boy wandering around, and he had survived that massacre. And so they took him, christened him, I think it was the very next day, called him Robert Hobart May. And of course, the fellow was Robert Knockwood. So named after him, disregarded his proper name. And we don't know what happened to that little fella. And he was the first stolen child. Generally speaking, I think the history books didn't talk about our freedom fighters and the war that was fought here. So the war of resistance. And so it's important for you fellas to know that our people defended our country, their country. And, you know, there's so much to tell of this story, but I'm going through it really briefly. But the government became frustrated and employed an Englishman, George Augustus Robinson, in 1832 to negotiate with Aboriginal people to end the war. And so he promised that if they agreed to leave their country or countries for a time and go to a place which ended up being Waibalena on Flinders Island. Waibalena means black men's houses, that they would you know, let things settle down with the colonisers on the Big Island, and they would be able to return later. So at that place, Waibalena, our people were given English names. They were forced to stop speaking languages and practicing culture. And in a very short space of time, many of those old fellas died. In 1847, there were 47 of the original 200 plus people that were removed to Waipalena left in just such that's a really short amount of time, and they were removed from Waipalena and moved down south of the island to a place that called Oyster Cove, that they called Oyster Cove. Putalina is the proper name for that place, and that's just out of Hobart if you have a look on a map. Robinson was paid nearly £1,000, which, you know, would be a huge sum of money, and granted 2,500 acres of Aboriginal land for his success of removing the remaining people from their country. Now, I've put a couple of images there. Malapuina Rana is this young fella here, and Tana Minawait, this young fella here. They were both freedom fighters. They accompanied Robinson around as with other Aboriginal people who were interpreters and guides as he went around the island, you know, trying to negotiate with Aboriginal people to remove them. He did such a good job here in Lutruwita that he got the job of Protector of Aborigines in Melbourne. And he took with him a few Aboriginal people from here to do the same sort of thing, to try and, you know, assist him with making contact with the Aboriginal people in Victoria. It backfired on him. Our people joined the Victorian Aboriginal people in their resistance. Unfortunately, a couple of shepherds were killed. And these two Tasmanians, or not Tasmanians, these two Aboriginal people, one from the northeast and one from up the northwest, were hanged on that day in 1842 for their crimes. So survival. This is a little aerial view of what we call the corner on a little island called Truwana, or Cape Barren Island. This is this now is Aboriginal land. Back in 2005, all government land was handed back to our community. The history of this place goes, you know, there were raids on our communities, on our peoples around the around this eastern, mostly around the eastern, southeastern seaboard, but around the coast of the whole island, who took women from their communities as slaves and took them to the Bass Strait Islands. And Cape Barren is one of the islands in Bass Strait. The women were treated very cruelly. As I said earlier, 9 women survived and began families, our community families now, who's come from those women who survived with the sealers on those islands in Bass Strait. There was a reserve established for the 80 Aboriginal people living on Cape Barren in 1881, and then it was legislated twice again in 1912 and 1951, it was abolished because of the notion of Truganini being the last Tasmanian Aborigine, so we were extinct. And of course, they had a reserve on Cape Barren for Aboriginal people. It was an Aboriginal reserve. And so that was a bit of an anomaly. So how can they have a reserve for Aboriginal people if we were extinct? And so that was abolished, and our people were encouraged, if you like, to leave the islands and come to mainland Lutruwita. So language, and this is all of this survival and this language revival and retrieval is an act of us taking over the narrative, taking control of the narrative of extinction and of continuation and, you know, all around authenticity of information that is put out there largely by non-Aboriginal people. So I think we know that, you know, languages identify who we are. And certainly as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here, they carry the ethical values of our ancestors, the knowledge systems of our country, of our elders, past and present, and on into the future, future generations. Aboriginal access to our language is also fundamental to the health and well-being of us as individuals, families and communities. Here in Lutruwita, as in any Indigenous person's country, our languages were the first to be spoken. But I did not grow up speaking my language as a result of the history of invasion and colonisation, and nor did anybody else in our community. How am I going for time?
I think, you know, just a few more minutes.
Okay.
If that's okay.
Right. Well, I'll skip this and I'll get to here. So none of us grew up speaking our languages. Families, particular families within the community, descendants of those 9 Aboriginal women, or some of those women, remembered some phrases, some words and song fragments, particularly Fanny Cochrane Smith's family and the women from the Bass Strait Islands, which is where Zoe and I are from. Also, there were about 20 different European recorders who wrote down remnants of those original languages in word lists. Robinson was the most prolific recorder of our language, and he also wrote a lot of information about cultural practices and about our country in his journals as well. And so they are the only surviving representation of the original sounds of the Pakana languages, and they are very important to us as a community in retrieving, reconstructing and reviving our language. These are some of the documents that we use within the Palawakani program. So this is from the D'Entrecasteaux expedition. I think that is also from the D'Entrecasteaux expedition. And this is just an excerpt of one of Robinson's journals. Palawakani is one language now. It's a combination of all of those original languages because there's not enough information about or word lists of any one of the original languages, and so the community decided it would be a composite language and called it Palawakani, just Tassie blackfellas speak. We developed, there's so much to talk about with regard to our language retrieval, but we developed our own alphabet. So Palawakani really is one huge research project that is informed by a number of small research projects. And so one of those was about the sounds that occur in our languages and you know, we found that some sounds don't occur in our languages as well. And so we developed our alphabet to include to represent the interchangeable sounds that are listed there. And so we only have enough letters in our alphabet, and we consistently write those interchangeable sounds one way, but we can obviously use either in our pronunciation. This is a document that we developed, and it's a work in progress, really. Even you know, we started this back in probably 1997, and we're still refining it. But it's a word history. So for every word that's revived, we use this document to list every single English spelling or European spelling of that word. Whatever we can tell our community, it is predominantly for our community. You see, you know, why we chose that word for Nipaluna, which is a word for Hobart. Particularly if there are other words for that place or, you know, for that tree or whatever. And so every single thing I find about that word is on that word history. That's about being authentic and, you know, providing rigorous research and findings of your research to your community. So we've witnessed a community, you know, from one without a language, a spoken language that is, to one with a couple of generations who have access to their own language once again. And we have had too, the first publication of Palawakani Dictionary in 2013, and the second was the second edition with probably 300 more words was in 2019, and we're probably about due for another one. And we're able to, you know, speak, sing, you know, recite poetry, etc., in our own language, Palawakani, because of our ancestors, because our ancestors told some of our language to white people who wrote that information down. And so this is just another example of Robinson's manuscript journals. And you see here, you know, Larapuna, which is a very important place for us. But, you know, I want to acknowledge those old fellows that walked my country, Lutuwita, with White Robinson and told him that information and gave him the names of places and people and tribes. And there's some of the people. And we honour our old people, Pakanangini, when we talk in our language and refer to the proper places within our country. So I think that, well, you know, that's just, I think that's not a bad place to stop. We revive with language revival. We're able to also retrieve information, you know, about dance, about some cultural practices that were so severely impacted on that we didn't do them for a time, but now we're able to revive some of those cultural practices as well. And retelling stories like that creation story in our language and singing the old songs. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Theresa. That was really engaging and interesting to follow, and also appreciate the personal way in which you've told it from the start. It was, in a sense, our first lesson in Palawakani for many of us. Yes. So thank you very much. I'll now move on to Antonio, who has joined us by phone. So hopefully this works. Let's make Antonio ask him to unmute himself. And then let's see if this works. Hopefully it all works well. Let's see, Antonio, do you hear us?
Hello. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Perfect. Well, then I'll just go ahead and introduce you, if that's okay.
I have to apologize with yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. So now we're turning to the Caribbean to hear from our next speaker, Antonio Castanha, who is a longtime Indigenous rights advocate and scholar. He was inspired and active in the Hawaiian sovereignty movement for many years under the mentorship of Dr. Kekuni Blaisdell. In 1999, he was a delegate to the International Hague Appeal for Peace Conference, addressing numerous Indigenous rights concerns, particularly the myth of the European discovery of the Americas. And in 2000, he was project director of the Indigenous Peoples delegation that went to the Vatican, calling for the abrogation of the 1493 papal bull Inter Caetera. Dr. Castanha is the author of The Myth of Indigenous Caribbean Extinction, Continuity and Reclamation in Borican, Puerto Rico, which unravels deeply embedded mythologies concerning Indigenous Caribbean history and peoples. The book significantly gathers oral tradition and oral history, ethnological accounts provided by Caribbean Indian descendants. He is Boricua Jíbaro himself and recently taught for a number of years at the University of Puerto Rico. He's also a longtime lecturer of American Indian Studies in the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. So, bienvenido, Antonio. The floor is yours.
Buenos dias. Gracias. Yeah, I have to apologize. My computer somehow, the technology is not hooked up for Zoom, and I frantically was able to get on the phone call. So I'm happy to join everybody. So I'd like to start by saying aloha kako and guaitiao. The guaitiao is an indigenous Caribbean greeting of peace and friendship. So I'd like to greet everybody today and thank the Cambridge group for putting this event together. I'd like to start by giving an example of one of our themes, the theme of erasure, in terms of, in regard to the Caribbean. I was teaching one of my classes last semester, and one of my students cited in one of her papers the International Working Group for Indigenous Affairs, which is a global human rights organization, which is a pretty reputable, pretty well-known organization which recognizes and documents issues and rights concerning Indigenous peoples. They've done a lot of very good work for a number of years. I first learned of them in the 1990s. They had penned a couple publications regarding the Hawaiian nationhood and Kanaka Maoli issues. So they've done quite a bit of work in the Pacific, but as I was scanning through their publications, their annual publications, of course, I was looking for, Caribbean issues or, places that they've reviewed. And sort of in typical fashion, the Caribbean is sort of nowhere on the map in terms of this organization. They did have a couple of write-ups on the Guyanas, Suriname, Guyana, and French Guyana, which are considered circum-Caribbean nations. There's no mention of Dominica and the Caribs, neither Saint Vincent and the Black Caribs, nor Trinidad and Tobago. And we know in those places there are recognized indigenous populations, and much less the Northern Antilles. Of course, no mention of Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, or Cuba. So, I was a little surprised, that this regional documentation does not seem to be a priority of this group, given their reputation. But, they have done a lot of good work. But, this blanketing is just an example, or, it's understandable given the legacy of the belief of indigenous Caribbean extinction. I would like to just expand for a moment on the introduction that you gave, Oliver. So, this is quite I'm pretty personally engaged in the issue. I am a descendant of indigenous Caribbean peoples who were present in the late 15th century, who had to endure the ravages of the colonial Spanish. My ancestors were Jíbaro Indian campesinos, or farmers from the southwestern region of Puerto Rico in the mountains. They were recruited in the late 19th century by sugar plantation laborers by the Hawaiian Plantation Association here. There was a great hurricane in 1899, San Siriaco, which devastated the southwestern region of Puerto Rico. Over 3,000 people perished. So these sugar planters, ironically, were looking for laborers. They recruited over 5,000 Boricuas to come to Hawaii. So, you know, while I have made many trips to Puerto Rico, I lived there for a number of years. I lived actually through the ravages of Hurricane Maria in 2017, which was quite an experience. I am, you know, one of the diaspora, acknowledged diaspora, but, you know, most Boricuas in the diaspora have very strong ties to the homeland, to Puerto Rico. There's a great quote by the poet Juan Antonio Correger, which reads, "Yo sería Boricua aunque nacería en la luna," which means I would be a Boricua even if I were born on the moon. So there's a strong connection there. So with a particular focus on Borinquen, Puerto Rico, I'd like to discuss this erasure a bit, together with what went into survival of the indigenous population, along with continued constructionist narratives. Perhaps the most damaging and long-lasting impact of the Indo-European encounter was how Spanish theologians and scholars rationalized and solidified the belief of extinction. This is not to downplay the horrible atrocities, spread of diseases that did take place, and attempts at genocide that did occur. We are not downplaying this. That did happen. However, Spanish colonialists and scholars often exaggerated the effects of colonization and spread of disease to secure favors from the Spanish crown. I mean, if the population was just about decimated and no more, then those there would need support and resources. Population counts were also routinely downplayed to boost the importation of African labor. The Spanish denial of the Black legend of atrocities committed precluded issues of native land claims and reparations. Bartolomé de las Casas, who is a renowned theologian, he did it to promote the argument for the peaceful conversion of native peoples. In his mind, the population was dwindling, and you know, so he was advocating for converting as many people as possible before they were all gone, quote unquote. Of course, Las Casas was originally a slaveholder himself, but you know, he kind of, you know, reformed himself and became quite a defender of the native peoples. But on the other hand, you know, he's also responsible for sort of wiping the people off the map. For example, in the Dominican Republic, where he was based, he had estimated 3 million people there originally. Estimates range from about 3 million to up to 8 million people who were present in what was known as Quisqueya, which was Haiti and the Dominican Republic. But he rationalized that figure down to a mere 200 by the mid-16th century. And then he extrapolated that number to Jamaica and Puerto Rico, where it's been estimated the populations there were anywhere from 30,000 to a million peoples. He extrapolated that number to Jamaica and Puerto Rico, saying, yeah, well, there were only 200 people who were present in these islands without even having gone there, as far as I know. These were purely blanket assessments. There were no scientific studies, demographic studies done. This information became passed down over time. These respective, I mean, Las Casas was a respected figure. So, you know, basically, this information was parroted by scholars in virtually all academic studies until very recently. It just shows the power of the word and how, you know, these they weren't studies. I mean, these assertions were just taken for granted. and, you know, basically wipe the people off the face of the map. However, there was a tremendous amount of resistance, both active and passive, which I unfortunately don't have enough time to get into, nor the abundance of oral tradition and oral history I've collected over the years from Native descendants. But with regard to Indigenous survival in Borinquen, there's been virtually no analysis of pre-European Indigenous mountain presence. I've gone through the literature, and most scholars do not acknowledge that there were people who had populated the vast mountain regions. It was as if these regions were completely barren. But we know from the evidence, from the names of provinces, the Indian names of provinces and Yucayekes, the archaeological evidence uncovered, the artifacts uncovered, the bates and ceremonial grounds in the mountains, that there were people and provinces throughout Puerto Rico where Indigenous peoples were living long before the Europeans ever showed up. This is also, not to mention that when the Ponce de Leon arrived and there was conflict, many peoples escaped to the mountain regions. Anybody who's been to Puerto Rico knows that the mountain region is pretty vast, and you can get pretty lost up there. So this mountain presence is not acknowledged. There were also censuses conducted, but these censuses only measured encomienda populations, that is, Indigenous peoples who were subject to forced labor or slavery, all but in name. These censuses only measured encomienda populations in two regions, primarily the northern region of Puerto Rico near San Juan, and in the southwestern region of San German. That's where Indigenous peoples had been present in these encomiendas, and these were also, the information was also taken from church baptism records, and most Indigenous peoples had not been baptized. So it was surmised, Francisco Lando's census of 1530 surmised that there were less than 2,000 Indigenous peoples present in Puerto Rico at that time. However, again, these censuses did not measure the vast mountain region and rural areas where we know that there were many people still living. So that it's a very low figure. We also know that the native population survived until at least the late 18th century. The 16th century extinction is contradicted as the government itself continued to estimate the indigenous population, or indios, through late 18th century censuses. Notice that there's a 250-year gap here between the mid-16th century extinction and continued presence in the late 18th century. However, these censuses, the 1771 and 1778 censuses, only measured about 2,000 inhabitants from one area only, which was Maricao. Those were the San German indigenous peoples who had either fled or were freed. So they ended up in Maricao, and those censuses only measured the populations in Maricao. Again, it did not discuss it. Peoples throughout the islands were not considered in these censuses. Nevertheless, shortly afterwards, in the early 19th century, the category Indios became expunged from the record books when the governor of the island was faced with the difficulty of fixing ethnic origins. This occurred at a particular moment in time when, for the first time a Puerto Rican nationalist identity and consciousness begins to form. So this is when the notion of the Puerto Rican, more of like one people concept, begins to form. Interestingly, this nationalist sentiment comes to then romanticize the notion of the Indian as an entity frozen in time, ultimately relegated to its pre-European contact authentic past. Here is where the notion of purity as erasure comes in, where only pure socially constructed identities count. This anachronistic Darwinian concept of the Puerto Rican Indian has been forcefully shoved down the throats of Puerto Ricanos by the government, institutions, the academy, and even by the nationalist independence movement for over the past 200 years as an accurate description of self. Mixed or mestizo indigenous cultural survival, which defines most indigenous peoples the world over, akin to Jose Maria Aguirre's concept of cultural mestizaje in Peru that defines a native capacity to change and assimilate foreign elements, doesn't count in Borinquen. It is a racist biological swipe. This is despite the fact that it was primarily Jibaro Indian descendants, including Afro-Boricuas, who populated rural and mountain regions of the island throughout the 19th century, and who were the foot soldiers of the independence movement that drove the Spaniards out of Puerto Rico in 1898. Guyanese scholar Shona Jackson writes about the displacement and marginalization of indigenous Caribbean peoples in colonial and primarily post-colonial contexts, and how in the latter genre, the nation-state map was redrawn as a reflection of settler Creole social being and material right. Settler colonialism defines the landscape today in Puerto Rico as the Criollo elite, primarily locally born wealthy descendants of Spaniards, and those also of mixed origin, have wielded power, influence, and maintained control over the island, over island affairs, institutions, and lands for centuries. The recently ousted and disgraced President Ricardo Rosselló is a perfect example of those who continue to have an utter disdain for the population at large, and of course, those who dare to utter an indigenous identity. This is not to mention recent DNA studies that have revealed over 61% of Puerto Ricanos having tested positive for Amerindian DNA today. And this is from the female line only. To conclude, some Caribbean scholars are well aware that this very discussion may generally be interpreted in post-colonial theory as quote unquote essentialist renditions of culture, ethnicity, or identity. This presumes a sort of reproduction, quote unquote, of culture or identity. But this interpretation in relation to the Caribbean has been critiqued as essentialist itself in its westernized analysis, with some such as Forte not seeing much leeway between quote unquote essentialism and its not so different constructionist critics. This has contributed to an increasing number of scholars who have questioned the rigid opposition to and value of the concept. Yet regardless of the academics, most Native peoples of the Caribbean continue to go about their everyday lives in their own ways. Most seem to know the impossibility of, quote unquote, returning to the past, and are likewise oblivious to notions such as hybridity. As all cultures adapt and change over time, or certainly risk disappearing, so too has the indigenous Caribbean in moving forward into the foreseeable future. Thank you. Gracias.
Gracias, Antonio. Thank you so much for sharing with us. We're so glad you made it in the end and we could still hear your presentation. I think it's echoed greatly with some of what we've already heard today. And I saw a lot of nods as well from Theresa. So I think so. But in the interest of time, we should hurry and get to our next speaker, our final speaker for tonight, also from Lutruwita, Tasmania. And she'll share with us a perspective from the museum and heritage management sector. So please join me in welcoming Zoe Rimmer, who is a Pakana woman from Lutruwita as well. Zoe has grown up connected to her community, country, and culture, and has learned the cultural skills of basket making and shell stringing from her elders. Zoe has worked in the museum and cultural heritage management sector over the past 20 years and is currently the Senior Curator of First Peoples Art and Culture at the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, TMAG, and a Senior Indigenous Scholar at the University of Tasmania, UTAS. Zoe's PhD candidature at UTAS follows on from her work in repatriation and First Peoples museology. She's also the Deputy Chair of the Tasmanian Aboriginal Heritage Council and previously held a role as co-chair of the National Advisory Committee for Indigenous Repatriation, ACIR. Zoe is passionate about increasing First Peoples' voice and perspectives across cultural institutions and public spaces, as well as utilizing collections and archives to maintain, revive, and elaborate cultural practices. Zoe will discuss the museum's role in extinction myth-making and the importance of repatriation and cultural revitalization for the Pakana Tasmanian Aboriginal community. And with that, welcome Zoe, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you. Yapalingana, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, and it's been incredible to sit here and listen to everybody speak and think about all of those parallels and similarities. So I'd say Mina Tanapri Waranta Takamuna, Milathina Muanina Nipaluna Luchuita, Mina Tanapri Ningimpi Nungapi Naramapali. So acknowledge the country of the Muanina people of Nipaluna Hobart, Tasmania, where I live and work and where I'm speaking from today. And I also pay respects to our ancestors and elders. And I'd like to extend that acknowledgement and respect to all First Nations people joining this event, and particularly for the courage and resistance of First Nations communities around the globe in continuing to debunk these myths of extinction. I'm also really pleased that I've got to, I'm following on from Auntie Theresa, who is actually, as she mentioned, she is my auntie, and I'm very, very lucky that I get to share an office with her at the University of Tasmania, and we're on this PhD roller coaster ride together. And we also do a lot of work together in the museum and interpretation space. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those projects. So yeah, thank you, Auntie Theresa, also for giving that really brief run through of our history. So as mentioned, Lutruwita, Tasmania, in Lutruwita, Tasmania, archaeology is slowly catching up to our old histories and our belief that Pakana people have been here forever. So we have sites here that are dated to 40,000 years old. And there's also research currently happening into burning practices, which is putting that date much further back. So basically we have been here forever. But not so long ago, in the space of just one generation, our people were almost entirely wiped out. The British invasion of Tasmania in 1803 brought with it all the brutalities of colonisation. It was swift and it was brutal, and I'm just going to share my screen now because I have a lot of images I want to share. So yeah, as I said, it was swift and it was brutal, and Auntie Theresa covered a lot of that as well in her presentation. And by 1876, with the death of Truganini, the Aboriginal people of Tasmania were considered extinct. Truganini was imagined by non-Aborigines to have been the last of the Tasmanian race. She became an emblematic and historical figure. She survived the Black War and subsequent incarceration at Waibelena and Oyster Cove, and she's become the most written about Tasmanian Aboriginal person. Truganini's life story and her justified fears that her remains would be mistreated are also really well documented. And we really can't have a conversation about Truganini without talking about the extinction myth. And we generally can't have a conversation about Tasmanian Aboriginal people without Truganini being brought up. So when Truganini died, she was actually buried here, this image of the Cascade Female Factory. She was buried there. That was a convict prison at the time, despite her recorded wishes that she be either taken out to the Deontay Casto Channel and buried in the sea, or buried behind Konani, our mountain here in Hobart. And she wanted those things to happen because she was really scared about what would happen to her body after she died. Unfortunately, she was buried here at the Cascade Female Factory, and only 2 years later, the government gave the Royal Society permission to disinter her and put her remains in the Tasmania Museum and Art Gallery. So that's the museum that I have been working at for almost the last 20 years. Before Truganini died, she was actually labelled the last of her race, even then. But our families survived through a small number of women who were abducted by sealers and taken into the Bass Strait Islands, as Theresa talked about earlier. So Cape Barren Island became an Aboriginal reserve from the 1800s through until the 1950s. And throughout this time, the government were denying the existence of Aboriginal people in Tasmania, and the Tasmania Museum and Art Gallery were also denying the existence of our community. Also, the families of Fanny Cochrane Smith, and this image here shows her. She was recording language and songs, Aboriginal songs, for the Royal Society in 1903, even though they were still claiming that there were no Tasmanian Aboriginal people. So the island communities on Cape Barren Island and Fanny Cochrane Smith's families were considered something less than Aboriginal, not white, but not Aboriginal. They were an inauthentic community. Some more recent images of my family. So my nan, Connie Mansell, spent time, she grew up on Cape Barren Island, which, like as we've talked about, was an Aboriginal reserve, until the assimilation policy began moving people off the island in the 1950s. So it was my nan's generation who suffered this really overt racism of segregation, assimilation, and the welfare system, all of which targeted our community because they were Aboriginal, but yet there were no Aboriginal people left in Tasmania. And it was my mum and my aunts, Auntie Theresa's generation, who were part of a larger movement of Aboriginal activism, becoming politically organised through the establishment of community organisations, the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre, in the early 1970s. And at the core of this activism, at the core of the community's activism was land rights and repatriation. And both of these things have become foundational to the fight for recognition of identity as the surviving Aboriginal people of Tasmania. So I come from this really long line of Pakana women, basket weavers, shell stringers, and mutton birders and activists. And I think that's why I've ended up working at the very museum that's caused our community so much trauma in trying to, we're trying to reclaim that space and that control over our cultural heritage to tell our stories from our perspective. And today that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about, is the museum's role in extinction myth making. It's very early in the morning here. And how repatriation, which really began here in Tasmania with the community's fight against the Tasmania Museum and Art Gallery, and how that has was part of the resurgence of the community. And also how we've been able to utilise the museum collections to revitalise our cultural practices and reimagine our identity and create interventions in colonial spaces where we've previously been silenced. So a little bit of background, these are some images from some of the old displays at the Tasmania Museum and Art Gallery. Right down at the back wall at the far end of this picture, you could just make out the images of some of our people, and there were cabinets there with cultural objects, all amongst the flora and fauna of Tasmania. So the Tasmania Museum and Art Gallery does have this really horrific history. It began as the Royal Society of Tasmania, and the way that the museum and the Royal Society treated our community is quite horrific. They played a major role in grave robbing and trading of Aboriginal ancestral remains, both within the museum, but also traded them all around the world. They placed a really high value on our ancestors' remains because of the assumption held by natural scientists from the mid to late 19th century that Tasmanian Aborigines represented the most primitive phase in the evolution of humankind. And our imminent extinction fueled a really keen and urgent interest in collecting our material culture and ancestral remains. And it also determined how these collections were interpreted right up, late into the late 20th century. So this image is of the Tasmanian Aboriginal display, and I've actually just blocked out there. That's where Truganini's skeleton ended up hanging from 1907 to 1947, alongside our cultural objects, portraits of our people, busts of our people, in this cabinet of curiosity, which memorialised this supposedly extinct race. Then came the diorama. This was an exhibit created in 1931, and as you can see, it's heavily informed by ideologies of Tasmanian primivity, presenting this really idyllic yet extinct people. It was envisaged as necessary response to the lack or supposed non-existence of our community, and later became a replacement for the display of Truganini's skeleton. So the diorama is supposed to be Truganini, her last husband Waradi, and an imagined child. And this early iteration of the diorama, it sort of changed a little bit over time, but in this image you can actually see Waradi is wearing a sacred jawbone amulet. Truganini has a shell necklace wrapped around her neck, so that the diorama itself became also a way of displaying these important cultural objects. Although those objects were removed, the amulet was actually repatriated to the community, and the diorama kind of changed a little bit over time, with explanatory labels that explained how offensive this diorama was to the community. This was still the focal point of the exhibition when I first started at the museum in 2003. And it sat alongside these massive petroglyphs that were stolen by the museum in 1962. And actually we're preparing now this year to return those tons of really, really fragile petroglyphs back to country. So as I mentioned, when we think of Truganini, her image has become synonymous with this wider history of genocide. But for the Tasmanian Aboriginal community, her image represents unbelievable loss and deception, and at the same time, resilience, continuity, and strength in cultural identity. And it's within this context of denial of existence and identity that the Tasmanian Aboriginal community has pushed for recognition and rights to land and culture, knowing that we have always been here and will continue to always be here. So the Aboriginal rights movement in Tasmania really began in the 1970s, and with this campaign to have Truganini's remains released from the museum, and for her to be given a respectful ceremonial farewell. And when that happened, it marked the origins of the repatriation campaign in Australia. And it was influential in the formation of the contemporary Tasmanian Aboriginal community. Part of the battle for the repatriation of Truganini, and then quite a number of other ancestral remains from the museum, known as the Crowther collection, most of the battle, and this happened over quite a number of years. The community had to take the museum to court, all sorts of campaigns and protests to have ancestral remains released from the museum. And really it was about recognising the community as being the survivors of the Tasmanian Aboriginal people and the right people to have the remains back, to do the right thing with them. So I guess throughout the repatriation campaign, the museum began to recognise the community and began to recognise that they needed to start building a relationship with the community. And that's where the past 2 decades of our curatorial work has focused on activating the collection through Aboriginal-led curatorship, research and projects that assist in the maintenance and revitalisation of cultural practices. So this long process of relationship building and incremental changes in thinking, you know, people are now referring to this as indigenizing the museum, I guess. But what it really is about us being able to take control back of our heritage. So when we view collections as conduits for revival and inspiration and to support the continuation of cultural practices, we've started working with the community on looking at these historic collections. So this is an example of a toilini, a bark canoe. We've got these old 1840s models in the museum, and we've used archival material, and we're able to run a project to revive the building of full-size canoes that are now, you know, something that's continued. We did similar things with our basket weaving. So basket weaving was a practice that was interrupted and stopped for a short period of time. And we used the historic baskets in the museum to help revive that practice. And so you can see the difference with these more contemporary exhibitions that are curated by the community and in collaboration with the community to the old exhibitions that were based around extinction. This was the most recent project on shell stringing, and this exhibition toured the country sharing our story. These projects have been experimental in many ways, and we're shifting the curatorial paradigm for being traditional curator directed or dictated to understandings of objects, subject and exhibition to a community-centered approach with multi-layered narratives. And so we're shifting the focus more from the objects to focus on relationships. And undoubtedly, these transformations at the museum have only been possible and are in response to the early repatriation campaigns and the assertion of Aboriginal sovereign rights. Last year, the Tasmania Museum and Art Gallery and the Royal Society delivered a joint apology to the Pakana Tasmanian Aboriginal community for the treatment of our ancestors and our cultural material. And we're yet to see really any structural changes that might come out of this symbolic act. But part of the process has been about interrogating and responding to the circumstances in which objects were obtained and the context in which they're still held. So I mentioned the Premingana petroglyphs. This is an image of when the museum went and actually cut this large piece out of the rock face. And so this is something the museum has now committed to repatriating to the community and returning to country. This is the site on the west coast of Tasmania where we, under that big sand dune, is the remnants of that art gallery site. So another project we're working on is trying to return cultural objects. Excuse me, I'm just going to say goodbye to my daughter. She's off to school. So this project, Taipani Milaithinatu, Return to Country, we are trying to work with museums in the UK and Europe to try and return some of these really important cultural objects that have ended up in museums over there that we don't have access to here. And so these objects we want to bring home for an exhibition to reconnect with the community and to help inspire contemporary art as well. But it's incredibly difficult actually to loan objects and expensive. So this is an example of some contemporary artworks by some of our artists that are responding to those objects in museums overseas. I also wanted to talk really briefly about a couple of projects that have we've recently just shown and how we're now moving into sharing our stories more widely across Lutruwita. So and outside of the museum and gallery space. So here we creating interventions in the landscape and also in colonial spaces. And this was a project that I co-curated recently for the Mona Foma Festival, which is a summer music and arts festival here in Hobart. And this one, Panopiri with the Mapuli Many Suns and Moons, we actually collaborated with Robin Fox, who did this major laser show right across Hobart. So you could see these lasers from basically everywhere in the city. And the laser show synced with a soundtrack that people could listen to on their own devices from wherever they were in the city. And they could listen to the voices of Aunty Theresa and another Pakana woman, Shani Reid, sharing our creation stories. And that's the first time we've actually shared that depth of our creation stories with the broader community, and also to do it in such a spectacular way was pretty amazing. So this show went over the 3 days of the festival. As part of Mona Foma as well, I worked with Castanha Maynard and Vernon Arkey and the curators at Mona on this project. They created 2 interventions in really colonial parkscapes, I guess, here in Lutruwita. So one in Prince's Square in Launceston and the other on Parliament Lawns here in Hobart. And Parliament Lawns is where we hold all our protests and rallies that Theresa mentioned as well around Invasion Day. Yeah, they painted these massive red words onto the bitumen around these colonial fountains and disrupted that landscape. And we had a soundscape playing as well that moved through moved through history and emotions around the Black War, dispossession, stories from Cape Barren Island, and then also the sounds of protests. This is an aerial view of one of the works. So again, this work only lasted for 3 days for the life of the festival. And as people walked through the park, the words became more sort of trodden into the bitumen and spread out. And now to go back to Truganini again and the Cascade Female Factory. So Aunty Theresa and I have been working with the management authority that run the Cascade Female Factory and a design team. They're redeveloping the site. So not much of that building exists anymore. It's basically just the sandstone walls, but they've built a new interpretation centre. And this is a world exclusive sneak peek, because I was actually just installing this exhibition yesterday. So it's not yet finished and it's not yet open to the public. But we've been able to put into that interpretation centre this story of our community, of invasion, the truth telling of invasion, but also the survival of our community. And we've also been able to mark that place as the place that Truganini was buried, and tell her story, and that story of what happened to her after she died in our way, from our perspective. So yeah, these are just a couple of install shots. It's not quite finished. You can even see, I think there's a vacuum cleaner in the background there. So this has just been a really kind of snapshot of some of my work and some of the work that Theresa has been doing as well, and how we are trying to challenge these myths of extinction through reclaiming our heritage, reviving our cultural practices, and taking control of the narrative through truth-telling interventions in colonial spaces. And resistance art. So it continues, and it gets more and more exciting every year. This is another install image, and basically the basket that's unfinished. That one is in the museum collection. We call it the interrupted basket, and so it's kind of a real symbol of that that sudden invasion and disruption of a cultural practice, and then through to a basket that's been made by one of our aunties today, just to symbolise that resistance and survival of our community. I'll finish there. So thank you, Nairi Nina too, and thank you.
Thank you, Zoe. It's really been such a privilege to hear from all of our speakers today, especially the range of disciplines that we've been able to learn from. We've heard about demographics, genomics, history, ethnography, linguistics, museum and heritage studies, anthropology. It's really been a buffet of different perspectives in that sense. And I think that really has made it an exceptional learning experience for us to cover this topic from all of these different angles. Having said that, we are over time. So I wanted to ask Zoe, Theresa, and Antonio if you still have a few minutes, maybe another 10 minutes or so we can entertain maybe one or two questions. Yes, from Theresa, Zoe?
Time for me. Everybody's left the house now, so I'm good.
Okay, perfect. Antonio, I don't know if you can hear us, or I think maybe we lost Antonio in that case. All right, well, let's see if there are any questions in the chat for, at least for Theresa and Zoe, unless Antonio can join us, but let's see for a few more minutes. Let's see if we have anything in the chat. A few comments. You can either raise your hand. Oh, Mariana has a question. Let's see if we can unmute Mariana.
Hello. Hi. Thank you so much. This was the best. So I'm just to position myself a little bit and to pay greetings to everyone. I'm from a community that descends from colonialism. So I'm a Portuguese descendant from Macau in China. We're also struggling, of course, not in the ways that you have struggled, but we're also struggling a bit with safeguarding the language that came out of these encounters. Whereas they were negative or positive, there was a language coming out of it. And I was just very curious about how you're coming up with new words, for example, for the word computer or airplane, because I think that's the struggle we're having, is the idea that languages are fixed when they're not, of course. And I'm just wondering, how are your communities coming together to kind of bring our languages up to a point where we can actually use them, and hopefully one day even make a presentation, an academic presentation in these languages? That would be amazing. So that's my question. And thank you so much for sharing everything you have shared. Thank you.
We haven't quite got to using, for making words for, the more modern inventions like computers, etc. We're still working on the vocabulary that recorders have made in word lists and that. So we're not quite there yet, and we're not sure. I guess I hope that the community will decide that we want to continue on with that. Probably not in my lifetime, because there's still a lot to do with what we've got already. But having said that, even though the context of language has changed from before invasion to now, you can be pretty creative while still maintaining the authenticity of meaning there, and bring those meanings or those words back into use, and stretching it a little bit creatively. So when I did a translation of, I don't know, probably people around the world don't know Goanna Band, you can Google Goanna Band, Shane Howard, and it's almost an anthem. It's a song called Solid Rock, and he does that in a couple of different Aboriginal languages. He's not Aboriginal himself, although he's an honorary uncle. But I translated the chorus of that song into Palawakani, and he sang that at an Invasion Day rally. And so we were able to be, you know, for instance, solid rock. Now, a rock, well, you know, it's solid. So how are we going to, you know, interpret that? And so I use the word lulangta, which is a large rock, you know, so lulangta is a solid rock. And so, and I won't go through the rest of it, but it's, you know, pretty innovative, I think. So I think there are different ways that you can do that and talk about computers. We're not quite there yet, but, you know, things like either Aboriginalising for us, you know, that word computer, or you know, making up a word out of words that you've already got for, I don't know, what's a computer? It's something that, you know, you can see stuff for. So just use, you know, making a compound word from two words that already exist, that means something to look at and get information from, or knowledge or something like that. Is that okay? Plus there's many other ways, I'm sure.
I wonder if, yes, I think Oliver might be having some connection issues. So if I could just step in, and I think Jean-Melissa Schramm had a question, if I could unmute her, if you'd like to ask it.
Thanks, Nishant. Are you able to hear me? Well, firstly, a particular delight to be hearing Theresa and Zoe this evening. For those of us who've not been able to get home for 2 years, this is just the most wonderful injection of home. Thank you so much for that. And I'm wearing Auntie Lola here in your honour, particularly Zoe, for all the work that you've done over many, many years to keep that culture alive and ensure that it's now worn all around the world. The culture is alive. I have so many questions for you. I teach legal history, constitutional thought, and I wish we could talk for hours, but mindful of time, I'd just like to ask you both a question about how you feel, perhaps particularly for you, Theresa, how you feel about Palawakani being now entering the wider cultural sphere. When I was a child in Tasmania, growing up in Launceston in the 80s, we watched Manganini, the film, which I'm sure you both know, with the language of Northern Territory peoples, because at that point, of course, Palawakani had not been revived for usage in the wider community. And now when we watch films like The Nightingale, we have the pleasure of seeing the language revivified. And I also teach my students here novels like Rowan Wilson's The Roving Party, obviously brutal, but astonishing in the way in which it insists on Palawakani as a living language. And I just wondered how you both felt about the emergence of Palawakani from the community where its usage has been treasured, but it's now, of course, becoming more recognized in the wider cultural sphere. And I think this is wonderful. My students think it's wonderful. And is that a sense shared by the community at home?
Yeah, you're right. You know, we are sort of 20 plus years down the track. We are sharing more and more of our language because, you know, it suits us now. From a community that had little language, if you like, to having this language to be able to, you know, include in feature films like The Nightingale. I was lucky I did the translation and worked with the actors on that one. And that was amazing to see our language up there on a big screen, you know, and subtitles in Palawakani. Wow. And so I think it's fantastic that we have come that far, that we are willing to share, you know, bits and pieces of it, and more and more. So I think it's just fantastic. We've come a long way in 5 minutes, really, in the scheme of things. Zoe, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's really exciting. I love hearing Aunty Theresa talk about the Palawakani program, and the research that goes into reviving every single word is incredible, and the knowledge that that research also revives. So one word can revive and give us back so much. But I think in terms of the broader community, in the last couple of years, I think have really embraced Palawakani, particularly through dual naming or renaming places as well in Lutruwita. So, you know, you hear everybody now using Kunanyi or Kunanyi Mount Wellington. And it just makes me feel really proud and excited and hopeful for the future as well.
Well, thank you, and just bravo to you both for all the work you've done over many years. Fantastic.
All right, let's do one more question so we don't go too much over time. Ashley, let me just unmute you.
Hi. I actually had a question for Keolu, but I'm assuming he's left the chat. But
yeah, unfortunately.
So, yeah, but I think sort of anyone can answer this question, any one of the speakers. So I'm currently doing, so I'm an Indigenous researcher at the moment at Cambridge, doing research on like temporality. And in a lot of like accounts in Indigenous scholarship, there's this sort of like resistance to bifurcate past, present, and future. Like there's sort of this interesting relationship between past and future. Like these two things, you can't really detach them. And Keolu brought up something really interesting. The future is in the past, right? But also, I think Theresa, you mentioned something about language as a way to access the past to also and the future. I think these are just from notes I've scribbled down. So I guess like anyone could answer this, like if you could speak a little bit more to sort of like the relationship between past and future in like any of the work you guys do, that'd be really interesting.
Thanks for that question. And I think you know, our present and our future is deeply grounded in our past. You know, it's because of our past and that we are such a strong community now. And I guess I should have mentioned in my presentation, we do have men in our community and some of them are strong, but, you know, because of the history of our community, we are more of a matriarchal society these days. And that, but, you know, I have to acknowledge our men who are also grandfathers and fathers and uncles and sons, etc. But in terms of that future, you know, those old fellas, I believe in my heart that those people who travelled around the state with Robinson as interpreters and guides, you know, they had a bit of an inkling of what was happening, and you know, they didn't tell him or other recorders every single thing. That's why there are so many gaps, but they told them enough to preserve for the future, for future generations, us that survived. And so now we, you know, the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre, who runs the language retrieval program, is taking that to new heights, if you like, by recording everything that those old fellows told those recorders when we revive a word, and you know, making that accessible to our community first and foremost, the here and now, but also documenting it for the future. And so it is, I saw now, I can't, I like that, I think it was Keolu who said something about the past and future, and the present, and it, you know, or stepping back to the past to walk into the future, and that was perfect. So that's all. Does that answer your question? And Zoe, you might have something.
I think you covered a lot there, but I was just thinking with your question, it made me think about this idea of timelines, and particularly in the museum world, museums love to put timelines on everything, and you know, Theresa talked about our creation stories, and I talked a little bit about archaeology putting dates and times on things. But you know, for a lot of Aboriginal communities, time is not this linear thing, and we don't just sort of say this is this time period, this is this time period. I love that notion of the future's in the past, and also the idea that we need to look to the past to see where we're going. Yeah, I don't think I'm really answering your question, but I think what you're talking about and the things that you're bringing up are really, really interesting, and huge differences in the way that I think First Peoples think and see the world to the way a lot of Western people think and see the world.
Thank you. That was perfect.
Well, thank you, Zoe and Theresa. I think with that, we should close. So in closing, I'd like to thank our speakers, Antonio, who messaged me, he had to run out to pick up his 6-year-old, and Keolu, who also had to run out because he had a class he was giving right after this. So, and Theresa and Zoe, thank you all. It's truly been an honor to host you here, and it has been a profound learning experience for me, and I'm certain for our audience as well. We can take a lot of the knowledge and experience that was shared here today, take it back to our own context, and hopefully put it to good work. I think the recording will also have a long life online, and hopefully be of great use to many who will watch it there. So we would also like to thank our audience for taking the time to join us and share their questions, especially those who have stuck around the extra half hour. And please keep an eye out on our website and on our YouTube channel to watch and share the recordings of today's event. That should be in the chat momentarily. And we hope you will join us for our next event, which will be a film screening of the movie The Beothuk Story. We will have a Q&A following the movie with the director Christopher Aylward, Chief Meisel Joe, and Carmen Bartlett. So we hope to see you there as well. And to learn more about our upcoming events and to register for them, you can visit our Crash webpage or our webpage that are linked below in the chat. And to get involved or give us feedback and suggestions for future events, you can also write to us at our emails that are also in our chat. Thank you once again. Thank you, Theresa. Thank you, Zoe. And thank you, Keolu. And Antonio for joining us today. It's really been a pleasure. Have a good night, a good day, a good morning all over the world.